We're here in Algoa Bay in South Africa.
Yeah.
This is a fantastic place. South Africa is a place of extreme biodiversity, and that's primarily due to the combination of temperate and tropical ecosystems that you find here.
Mm-hmm.
So on this side, on the eastern cape of southern South Africa, we've got a warm current that's coming from the tropics down south along this coastline right here. And at the southern point of South Africa, it meets a temperate ecosystem due to cold water flowing up from Antarctica along the western side of the country. So these two currents are coming like this and meeting at the southern point of South Africa. And because of that, you have these tropical ecosystems with beautiful clear water and nutrient poor systems with lots of coral reefs. Just 10 hours south, a pretty quick drive, you can hit really cold water and something like the Sardine Run, where you've got humpback whales in mass moving up along the coast of the African continent. And so there's incredible shark and ray biodiversity here. Something like 20 to 25% of all sharks and rays on Earth can be found in South Africa waters. It's an exceptional place to dive. As we've seen here, some beautiful, beautiful species. Beautiful sharks, pajama sharks, etc. And on top of that, there's an interesting conservation context here, right? Because we've been to the Maldives. It's a shark sanctuary. There's absolutely no fishing of sharks allowed. Multiple fishing gears have been banned. They've really gone towards an ecotourism-driven approach to managing those resources. And then there's a place like Japan or a place like here in South Africa where there's a lot of mixed use. There are intensive fisheries, including directed shark fisheries. And simultaneously, there are areas that are really driven by a conservation mindset, particularly on land, where you've got things like the big five, right? The rhino, the lion, the African elephant, the Cape buffalo, and the leopard, that people are paying a lot of money to go see in protected areas.
Absolutely.
And so some of that has transitioned to the ocean environment, largely because fishing is the primary threat to sea creatures, particularly big charismatic species, marine mammals, as well as sharks and rays. And so what is it about in the ocean, what we call marine protected areas, that make them effective management tools to lead to an increased abundance and diversity of these species?
Well, there's a paper that I think highlighted this best in 2014 by Edgar et al. This was in journal Nature, which is a very prominent journal. And they highlighted a couple prominent things that make MPAs particularly effective. And that is generally that they're no-take reserves. I know that it has a lot of controversy often with like fishers locally, but having no-take where nothing is being able to be removed from those areas really allows for those ecosystems to recover naturally. And then the other components of that are effective are that they are long-lived. So for species that take a long time to grow, that have long lives, like sharks and rays, that's particularly important for effective MPAs. But then you have the size of the MPA, which is extremely important. It needs to cover a lot of the habitats that species are within. And then lastly, it really needs to have really effective management and enforcement. Without enforcement, you can have all the best management practices possible, but it's not going to mean anything. And then apparently they have to be surrounded by deep water and sand too, so that so animals are contained within. So those are the big five that have been pointed out. We know from this area too, where we've been diving in the NPA, which we've not completely been in, but in the part that you just mentioned, there are a lot of the rays that have been studied in this area that the spatial movement of these animals does not correspond necessarily with the size of the MPA, so they move particularly outside of the MPA more than they're inside. So those rays and sharks are not being protected, and so that's hugely important.
Yeah, and I'll mention there that lots and lots of marine protected areas are placed in certain areas due to certain features that are not sharks and rays, right? So often this is a beautiful coral reef, or let's revise it, and then 10 years later, someone will say, "Oh, I wonder how often sharks and rays are in this area." And they find out that actually across the world, a very small percentage of shark and ray species live within protected areas, and most of their ranges fall outside of these areas where they're exposed to fishing pressure. So obviously there's this element of the size of the MPA, and then animals are moving, as you mentioned. So how do those two things interact? What about the animals themselves dictate whether they experience an increase in abundance or not, given the size of an MPA?
Well, if they move outside of an MPA, then they're open to fishing, right? Fishing impacts other human impacts, development, pollution, those sorts of things, which we know have huge impacts. I mean, oil spills and chemicals in the water, pharmaceuticals in the water, plastic pollution. if you can control one area, it doesn't mean that that animal that can move long distances way outside of that MPA is going to be protected from all of those impacts.
Right, and that could be, so that's fishing as well as all the stuff
Development,
where habitat destruction,
all of those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, the more areas that we can protect, the better we're going to be, and the more areas that we can have as no-take reserves, which for the general public that doesn't understand what that is, marine protected areas generally are classified in a lot of different ways, from the levels of things that are allowed inside of those protected areas, from diving to different types of fishing gear that are allowed. And so when I say no take reserve, that means that no commercial fishing is allowed or recreational, that sort of thing. And penguins are a good example of this here too, right? We
saw some on the boat.
We were fortunate to see African penguins, the only species of penguin in Africa. They're endangered, according to the IUCN Red List. Just incredible to see, right? And the cool thing is the MPA that you mentioned, the Addo Elephant National Park here, that also protects the marine part of the MPA. They are particularly protecting penguin populations, breeding colonies in these areas that are actually doing better here than they're doing in the Western Cape. So a lot of the penguins are thought to maybe be recovering here over what's happening in the Western Cape province. And so what's cool is that just this year in January, a paper actually just came out on this in Science, just in 2023, that was talking about how there's an increase in the populations from the protection of these breeding colonies, and the South African government's really gotten on board with this, and they've there's a decade-long moratorium on commercial fishing going on right now that started because there's been evidence showing that the penguin populations are increasing when you remove commercial fishing around those breeding colonies on their main forage prey species, anchovies and sardines. And there's been a direct correlation with how those forage populations, those forage fish, are doing with the penguins. So
I see. So they're protected in their breeding colonies.
That's right.
And yet they obviously don't live their entire lives there. They breed there and then they go feed offshore, and they're competing for anchovies with the fisheries.
Yeah, and one of the big problems is that same paper showed that from 1991 to 2021, there was a 73% decrease in the African penguin population. And again, part of that was due to the forage fish going down, but also pollution and other human impacts. So it's one thing that we can do that we know can be effective management.
Yeah, and that corresponds well with what we heard from the divers that were taking us out and showing us their home here.
Yep.
Saying that they used to see huge groups of penguins feeding on bait balls, and now
5 or 10.
Yeah, we saw 5 or 10,
which was cool for us, but
yeah,
abundant. We're a shifted baseline. We don't know, we know what's better, but our experience is still going to be exciting when we see a few. And the hope is that the increase in management and protection of these animals and their prey and their environments will increase those populations for more of that to happen.
Yeah. And we see that with sharks and rays as well, right? So you mentioned this issue of movement. You need to protect key parts of an animal's important habitats, right? Either feeding or breeding areas or movement corridors, with the understanding that sometimes they won't be protected. And so for sharks and rays, we see that here in South Africa. We're on the other side of the country, on the western side. Folks have studied how the abundance of certain small cat sharks, like we've seen here, leopard cat sharks and pajama sharks, how that abundance increases the further you go towards the center of an MPA.
Yep. Exactly.
As they move out towards the edges, they can be hit by fisheries of people fishing along those boundaries.
And they do. Those spillover effects is what that's called. People will literally fishing boats will line up on those edges of those boundaries to try to take advantage of that spillover effect.
Yeah. And so that makes complete sense then, that the species that don't move a whole lot, that exhibit high siphonality or are philopatric, right, are home-loving, will be more protected because their entire life will be spent within an MPA, whereas a highly migratory species might be in an MPA where there's no fishing for, Tuesday and Wednesday, and then the rest of the week.
There are multiple countries where whatever those management are. Yep.
Yeah. So that's really interesting because we've seen here that pajama sharks and leopard cat sharks are extremely abundant in these places where
we're
diving, and they're protected species, right? Whereas other species like the tope shark, or the school shark, some people call them, these guys are
also the Soupfin shark, for a good reason. Yeah.
They get hit by directed fisheries around the country, and in the most recent stock assessment, they were designated as being overfished, with overfishing still occurring, which means their population is a fraction of what it once was, and simultaneously is going down. And so, of course, there's this issue where we see like MPAs are really, really good at protecting species that don't move a whole lot, particularly that are benthic and habitat associated, whereas the ones that are far-ranging, you're going to need either really, really big MPAs or networks of MPAs to protect them across a big portion of their life history.
And the really important part that you hint on too is that the science of the ecology and behavior of the animals is hugely important to understanding how to also impact their management in a positive way. If you don't understand the animals and those things, how can you effectively manage them? And that's really an important point.
And there's a really cool effort right now through the IUCN, through the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, where the shark specialist group is coming together and creating what they're designating as important shark and ray areas. This is following actually the bird research community and conservation community who did this in the past. And they said, okay, if governments at the national level want to protect certain areas, we need to at least provide the information to say, this is where sharks and rays are hanging out. If you want to consider them in your MPA site designations, now you have that information. Here's a fact sheet for South Africa. This is going to be happening for this region actually in the next year or so, where folks, local experts on these species will come together and say, we know from our research this place is important for the duckbill ray or for the pajama shark, and then give that information to various governments all over the globe so that they can consider sharks and rays in MPA designations, whereas in the past, they often didn't at all. It's usually driven by marine mammals and birds, at least on the ocean side of things. Now we can add in the sharks and rays as well.
Yeah. So in other words, we have the tools for effective management. It's just a matter of whether or not they're implicated or put out there or not, right? Implemented. That's the word I'm looking for. So, and if we don't do that, we can go down, but I think the tools are there and we're seeing positive effects of that around the world. And this is one example here. And so I don't know, I'm hopeful that, we can continue these sort of positive trends in population recoveries of different animals, terrestrial, aquatic, semi-aquatic.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that there, because this national park, the Addo Elephant National Park, although the name is focused on elephants, there's the big five on land and more broadly the big seven, where you have the big five on land. And in addition, you have the southern right whale, so named because during the whaling period, people thought they were the right whale to kill because they were often at the surface and very easy to hunt. So add that to the list. That's number 6. And then number 7,
the white shark.
The white shark, which of course has driven a lot of ecotourism historically.
Huge, especially in South Africa, right?
Yeah. It brought a ton of money to the local economy as people flock to South Africa to see these incredible
animals that are still recovering. Yeah.
I'm hopeful that, South Africa has this really rich history of conserving terrestrial wildlife to the benefit of the economy and the animals themselves, to the point that some, like the elephant in this park, are experiencing pretty quick population recoveries, even for a very long-lived animal. Hopefully we can apply that conservation ethic to the oceans for animals that honestly are not that different. There are lots of apex predators that are out here that people still catch just for fun, as well as for food, and we should be conserving them and treating them with the same respect that we do this incredible wildlife on land.
Yeah, and it's really the same concept, right? The bigger the park that incorporates more of the animals within it in their ranges. Lions, African wild dogs, they have huge ranges, right? So you need more and more land that's good habitat to protect them, just like we're talking about with MPAs for sharks, rays, things that are long spatially moving animals. So you need the same thing for this terrestrial environment. So it's cool that actually this park, the Addo Elephant National Park, incorporates both. I've never heard of that before.
Land and sea.
It's
pretty. These are not distinct.
No, they don't need to be
connections.
Yeah.
And I think the more we recognize that, the more conservation can be effective in the oceans.
Good. It's a good positive note to end on.